This sounds a lot like liberalism with Marxist language. Yeah, just PMC. It's like, let's do this all over again. Let's just try this again and think that we're going to have better opportunities. I don't know if it was the New Left themselves that said this. I remember we're going to have a march to the institutions, primarily academia and media, and somehow get us to a point where the things that thwarted a working class consciousness from being able to constitute itself will somehow be overturned. And he doesn't even give a sober analysis of what that's led to and why it would make any sense to rehash that and give it another go. I want to get your take on. Just advocating for a pre-political turn to first rebuild civil society, and that Marxism is not anti-imperialism because national struggles are petty bourgeois, which is fantastic for these lovely liberals or progressives getting into dicey conversations about Palestine, about Ukraine, about Venezuela, or why not Greenland? So the pre-political.
Well, let's first of all talk about his bastardization of the work of Antonio Gramsci, because civil society in the prison notebooks is about bourgeois society, as you state, and the civil society institutions in bourgeois society. Gramsci describes them as the earthworks around the citadel of the state, basically. These are the barriers put in the way of the working class from not coming into an awareness of itself as a class, which is, I think, the central problem facing the American working class as of this moment. Numerically very large, consciousness-wise very weak. And the institutions of civil society, whether they wear a right face or a left face, are all still designed to be the earthworks of the American bourgeois state. Means the great socialist leaders taking over these institutions. This has been tried over and over again, and it always leads to the same results, which is a few people with a left background get a few jobs. It does not advance working class consciousness one iota, and then the same thing is suggested by the academics a few years later. It's an unrivaled opportunity. Jackson's Rainbow Coalition all over again, but this time with a much less charismatic frontman, if Chris himself is determined to front this up. It's amazing for a man who calls himself the last Marxist. His actual political ideas resemble everybody else on the American left who's out criticizing. My initial response was like, this is basically the same as the DSA. It's the same as their tactics. It's the same as the PSL tactics. It's the same as basically every other leftist organization going back to the 60s, which is to try and do two things. One, get back to welfare capitalism. So there's no real talk about like a strategy for socialism in anything that Cutrone says. It's about, well, we're going to go round certain obstacles. We're going to work within the boundaries of essentially the pre-existing leftist ecosphere, so to speak. And we're going to somehow rebuild some socialist formation out of that. The same as everybody else has said, like going all the way back to the 1980s. And it's amazing that this is all the great man, the last Marxist standing can think of. It's essentially all that stuff the DSA tried with Bernie Sanders. We're going to try it again, but without even a national political. So it's nonsense. And it just shows again the absolute poverty of like Western leftist thinking. The limit of their horizons is welfare capitalism. We can get into why it's an impossibility and why Cutrone is a stupendous hypocrite. Just briefly mention the historical context here. Welfare capitalism was possible for one moment in time. And if Chris was the great dialectic, then he would know that nothing remains still. So you can't recreate FDR's New Deal coalition, because the two central forces which made that up have gone, which is externally the Soviet Union and internally lawful CPUSA, Communist Party USA, both of which Chris denounces, of course, as Stalinism in loud and vitriolic terms whenever he gets the chance.
So a quote from John Locke: "When God gave the world in common to all mankind in Genesis, he commanded man to work and subdue it for the benefit of life." So the theme here is the labor theory of property derived from moral justification for taking land from unproductive peoples. You can see where this is going. And the impact is that this has influenced the founding fathers' imperial ambitions. And then now we get up to where Cutrone starts off with his historical grounding with the Empire of Liberty in Jefferson's words. So we should have such an empire for liberty, not exploitation, not domination, not any of this stuff, but liberty, like the good news, spreading the good news, baby. And, double-edged sword. For liberty as she, of course, she has never served. Sorry. I'm sorry. We should have such an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since the creation.
Hey, ladies, you've won. You've won.
I know. I'm like, wait a minute. What? We're ships and we're liberty. To massive happiness to ensue from the extending of our guts and Kagan want to make is that Jefferson's concept of the empire of liberty is fused with biblical, Lockean, and Enlightenment ideals to justify the expansion. And that's interesting, Alexander, don't you think? So we have Cutrone, who was an imperialist, Thaddeus Russell, who was an anti-imperialist anarcho-capitalist. And if you add those together, I think you get a zero.
I think you get a perfectly round horseshoe, which looked exactly like a zero tower. So, yeah.
Cancel each other out. I mean, it's been a while since I've done advanced algebra. Okay, so U.S. imperialism is rooted in a Christian-derived moral and psychological framework. Key ideas: dominion over the earth, evangelical mission to uplift, justification through conquest through labor and productivity. So here we get some materialism. And founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, etc., all integrated these ideas into their political philosophies. And
frankly, my dear, it's imperialism. But the question of then the presidency of Jefferson has to be addressed because it hits the reality of actual politics. You go away from the theory, you hit actual politics, and actual politics in the late is that unless you industrialize, then you are going to get re-subordinated by either England or France. And so Jefferson has to wrestle with this and embrace the idea of industrialization of the northern United States. Of course, the South remained mired in the slaveocracy. And I would also recommend for viewers that they do engage at this stage with the Lizardo when it comes to a thoroughgoing critique of this kind of liberalism. Lizardo basically goes underneath all the words to dig out the material reality of American Enlightenment liberalism. And all the brutality of the exploitation of the recently arrived migrant working class, and of course, the violent suppression and dispossession of the Native Americans. Now, you can't then, as Cutrone does, just pluck out the Jeffersonian idealism and present it as this permanent living thread through America, which has always been there. Now, what's always been there and has survived every sort of iteration of the American Republic and Empire is that the American presidents will always want Jeffersonian liberty or exporting their revolution to these new countries. But of course, as Jefferson faced the reality of needing to industrialize, so the post-Civil War unified United States morphed into an imperialist power via similar processes to and in Germany and in France. And so what happens to the Empire of Liberty? What happens to the Great Republic? Well, it becomes an empire.
Oops, I always come up small. Why is that? There we go. I'm going to bring everybody up so we can see if our audio is working straight away. So can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Can hear you just fine.
Oh my God, we can see each other and hear each other. It's a Guy Fawkes miracle. I'm going to turn the volume down. Okay, and we have Guy Fawkes here. I also have children who I said stay out of the first floor. Anyway, welcome. Hi, everybody. This is Morbid Symptoms. I'm your host, Tara Van Dyke, and I'm super excited to have Alexander McKay back on stage. He's my go-to MList, Marxist-Leninist. And I'm super happy to have Chris Cutrone here. And I just want to say right off the bat, Chris, thank you for being a good sport, coming on a series that's called Bad Trot Takes. And I'm sure you'll get in your response if you find that as if you, well, I'm assuming you don't find yourself to be a bad trot, but bad Trotskyist. Right. But if you find yourself to be a Trotskyist at all,
indeed.
I'm still learning the ins and outs of that 100+ year battle. Just to share a bit of an anecdote, it took me forever because I came into this, I came into Marxism and all that through the university route. And I remember when I would go to parties, whatever, trying to get more active, people would try to find different ways of asking me what kind of Marxist I was or what kind of socialist I was. And it took me forever to figure out what they were asking me as if I was a Trotskyist or a
right.
And I was like, well, you could have saved me. I would get something like, what are people talking about? Anyway, so those of you who have been watching my show or Alexander's, because he streams it, know that we've had about 4 or 5, maybe 6 bad trot takes. Chris, you may be unhappy to find out that you haven't always been the focus of those. They have been so it's nothing personal. It just kind of happens that I come across something you're saying and I that you put out, and I'm like, hey, what about this? So again, I appreciate it because I think it's good to get these things out and have a robust, sharp debate, but keep it fairly civil. We'll see how we go. I think you guys can. I think we can handle it.
We have a comrade.
Oh yeah. Yes.
We can handle that, or at least try to. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. So anyway, so Chris reached out and said, "Hey, why don't we have a discussion? Why don't I come? I come and give a response or an elaboration, etc., to some of your takes on my takes, to use my podcast language." I was like, fantastic, let's get this going. So I'm glad that you did that. This is what we're going to do. Most people have not tuned in. I'm under no false pretense that people have tuned in to hear what I have to say. I know they want to hear what you guys have to say to each other in your own regard. So what I'm quickly going to do, I'm going to just review the issues that we've had with your takes over, let's see, what have the articles been? There was an alternative to genocide, Israel, Palestine, and the left. I think we also did something about the Empire of Liberty. I'm not sure if that was also Greenland. I can't remember. Yeah, that was the Greenland one. Okay. And it just so happened that when I read that, I also saw something that Thaddeus Russell had did about the founding fathers. And so that just kind of came together. And then the last one was on socialist unity. I'm just going to go through the themes of the issues that we've raised. I doubt we'll get to all of it in any depth tonight, but of course, what gets touched upon is up largely to you guys. What you bring out in your initial response, Chris, and then the back and forth. So without further ado, please do like and subscribe. Hate watchers also welcome.
Where would we be without them?
Yes, that's right. So without further ado, I'm going to. I think this maybe will take 5 minutes. I'm going to go over a summary of the issues we've raised or talked about, and using your articles as, I don't know, foils or flashpoints to get at what you're saying, of course, but also larger issues. Then you'll have the floor for about 10 minutes, and then Alexander will respond, and we'll go back and forth. And can you let me know when your hard exits are so I can be mindful of that? I'm thinking I want to keep it no more than 2 hours from start to finish.
That's right.
And if we finish earlier, fantastic.
That's right.
Is that okay, Alex?
Yeah, that's
Awesome.
fine. That's fine.
You guys are very agreeable. Okay.
We'll see if it lasts.
Yeah. You know, Alexander, I suggested that you put a banner of Stalin behind you, and I could see you opted not to do that, and I understand why you
Why do
didn't,
I need that
but,
when
you
I
know,
have?
I'm not
when
going to
I- when I
pretend
have
not to
the
be
Stalin
disappointed.
bust right here. So,
Oh,
so there
you go. That could be a Greek god too.
Well, we
All
are.
right.
I very much am on brand this evening. You'll both be delighted to know.
There you go. All right. So the first main issue is Marxism and anti-imperialism, which has been kind of a thread, either direct or tangentially through what you've been talking about, at least as I have followed it the last couple of years. So we disagree with your claim that Marxism is not inherently anti-imperialist. So our reading of Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, as establishing imperialism as a distinct stage of capitalism, requiring concrete political analysis or political opposition, not just theoretical critique. And from that perspective, solidarity with national liberation movements, however imperfect, bourgeois, petty bourgeois, religious, etc., is a material necessity, not just moralizing about, these settler colonials or racists or etc. Although, of course, having morality is not a bad thing. So that's the one issue that I think is a clear source of contention or opposition. The national question and class struggle. So Alexander talked quite a bit how he sees in your frame it collapses national struggles into capitalism in general, thereby dismissing them as distractions from class struggle rather than recognize them as expressions of it. And historically, Marxists from Marx through Lenin and Mao supported anti-colonial movements precisely because they weakened imperial centers and opened up revolutionary possibilities. Of course, opened up being the operative word there. There's no guarantees. I'm to tell you guys that things can go sideways, backwards, all kinds of things. Treatment of Hamas and other resistance movements. My guess is we won't get too into the weeds on that. But I am within a characterization of Hamas and as well as gangster capitalism and reactionaries, religious fanatics, etc., just to be summarily dismissed, a bit too convenient and not really clearly tethered to my understanding of the facts of the matter and historical record. Not that, of course, they're all angels. Then the pre-political turn. So you're calling us our understanding of it from your brief article, and I think we watched also. You were on with Studebaker, I think, and talked about that. So we looked at that.
Yeah.
Calling for a rebuilding of civil society and what you call a return to the pre-political strikes us as a retreat from class analysis into something, I don't know, managerialism or NGOism or kind of like that's not the best word, but people get an idea. So we found this to be kind of reproducing the New Left's kind of long march to their institutions. Let's try this again, kind of old wine, new bottle. And just as an example of however well-intentioned, in my interpretation, just another example of kind of the exhaustion of the post-war left, and that we're kind of stuck in this loop of, I don't know, I guess, use the 5 stages of grief metaphor between bargaining and denial, and then some anger and desperation. But it's hard for us to reach acceptance that the old is done and that something else has to come again. There's a reason why I call my show Morbid Symptoms. Although I thought about calling it Schrodinger's bitch, but I thought that might be a bit too rough. I don't want to upset the people who, the churchgoers. They're also welcome. So let's see. And also that it seemed that this is, we came across that, your intervention, after doing a show and after the whole brouhaha over your party. With Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, and your party's for everybody, wink wink, unless you have conservative views. You want nice things, we don't like racism, fascism, all this kind of stuff. And so obviously your rhetoric was not the same, but it was kind of like, is this just another variety of let's try this again, just, but it'll work out differently this time? Down to it, is the limit of our horizon still just some version of welfare capitalism? And if that indeed the case, Alexander has pointed out that the political economy that we're in doesn't allow for that. So how are you going to afford, and if, I'll let him get into that, but this idea that with the current state of the political economy in the United States where you're at and Britain where Alexander's at, even if everybody wanted to go back to welfare capitalism, that the material relations are that would be difficult to do in any meaningful way. Trotskyist purism and Western parochialism, fancy words. So Alexander sees a continuity between your position and I don't know if it's neo-Trotskyite or if that's even, I'll let you guys hash that out. Tendency towards permanent critique, a stance that allows that focus on theoretical purity while avoiding solidarity with actually existing anti-imperialist movements because of all the problems that can present that you're well aware of. I think you've written quite a bit about that. And this results in a de facto alignment with liberal and imperial frameworks. So, and lastly, religion and culture, which also I think is probably not the main thing that we'll touch upon, but we'll see how it goes. Your dismissal of religion and in revolutionary movements, does this repeat a kind of secular Eurocentrism, treating Islamism, for example, as fascism, rather than analyzing its social basis and class character? So overall, we find the royal we of Morbid Symptoms, that your last Marxist posture perhaps transforms Marxism from a revolutionary politics into mostly an intellectual spectatorship. And what you call realism and sobriety could be seen as kind of an interrogative disavowal. That's my word, my play on fetishistic disavowal, hard to say. A defense against engagement with messy, contradictory movements, but nonetheless confront imperialism and all the things that we want to confront in practice. So I'll leave that there. I think that's enough. And again, viewers, don't worry. I doubt we're going to chew all that and swallow it tonight. But it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that we've been critiquing on bad trot takes, using several of those episodes, using Chris Cutrone's essays as kind of leaping off points and foils to make these points. So thank you again for coming, and I will give you, once you get to 10 minutes, if you get to 10 minutes, I'll give you some sort of indication, and then if you keep on going, Chris, I will cut you off. Okay. I'll do the same to Alexander. So no favorites when it comes to this. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. So some of the substantial points I expect will be brought out in the discussion that Alexander and I will have. But to begin with, I just want to sort of kind of let you guys know what my basic orientation is. So a long time ago, when I was in college and a member of the Orthodox Trotskyist Spartacus Youth Club associated with the Spartacist League, I watched a rerun of the Star Trek original series episode The Omega Glory from 1968, in which a post-apocalyptic civilization was beset by war between the Yangs and the Combs. I thought that this was what the end of history would look like, Maoists versus Trotskyists. I consider Stalinism to be simply right-wing Marxism, a right-wing liquidation of Marxism. It's easy to understand why communists in the Soviet Union and China have had to pretend to be Marxists, since they seem to represent the Russian Revolution's outcome. But there is no excuse for anyone who is not an apparatchik with vested interests in this pretense to accept this. I'm not sure why you are Stalinist. Is it ignorance? Is it opportunism? Or do you actually want to be the hangman of the revolution? Would you be Marxist at all if there were no actually existing socialist states to admire from afar? Similarly, I'm not sure what I am here to defend about myself, my ideas, my practical strategy, or my soul. Actual Stalinists and Maoists have rejected Daungism as revisionism and post-Mao China as a fascist-led state capitalist country. Mao himself said in the wake of the Cultural Revolution that the supposed left-wing followers of Marx often become fascists. Stalin and Mao themselves would regard you as revisionist, or maybe at best, a useful idiot. In my time back in the day, anti-revisionist Maoism was represented by the Maoist International Movement, or MIM Notes, and Jay Sakai's book, Settlers, represented this tendency. But they would have rightly rejected your perspective as non and even anti-Marxist. But divisions among Stalinists are long-standing. There was the Sino-Soviet split between Mao and Khrushchev, the Sino-Vietnamese War, various African, Asian, and Middle Eastern civil wars in which Communist China and the Soviet Union fought on opposite sides and chewed up cannon fodder in wars, nothing to do with socialism whatsoever. Each side called the other imperialist and had spurious pseudo-Marxist explanations for why this was so. There was also the US-China alliance under Mao against the Soviet Union, which involved these armed conflicts. Mao claimed to uphold Stalin against Khrushchev's actions, but even Mao said that Stalin's purge trials were wrong, too bureaucratic and authoritarian. His solution was the Cultural Revolution. His slogan was bombard the Communist Party headquarters. But now you defend the Chinese. Mao was calling to bombard the people in China you have placed your hopes in. He was calling to bombard you. On Israel-Palestine war, if I can speak personally, I was horrified by the October 7th attack, but not because of the atrocities against civilians, but because of what I expected the Israeli response would be. I identify spontaneously with the Palestinians, not the Israelis, and this is precisely why I oppose Hamas. Leaving aside the question of the struggle for socialism entirely, I'm opposed to terror, which I consider liberalism with bombs and reformism with guns, as Lenin called it. And he meant targeted attacks on the state, not communitarian violence against civilians. To defend it is to defend the slaughter of Palestinians that was its intended result. Hamas wanted this genocide to happen. They call it martyrdom. And that's why they are wrong, at least from a socialist perspective. Yes, Lenin said about Marxists who had qualms about the 1916 Easter Uprising, which had significant participation by Irish socialists, that if you can't stomach petty bourgeois outrages, you will not be able to support the revolution. But he meant the proletarian socialist revolution, whereas today we have nothing but petty bourgeois outrages and radical cheerleaders or spectators. We've had a century of so-called Third World Revolution. It has not brought the world closer to socialism, but it has distorted the minds of Western leftists. Which brings me to practical strategy. I have two distinct tracks, Platypus on the one hand, and my campaign for a socialist party on the other hand. I know Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Institute's mission is education and analysis. This makes you no different from any other left tendency, which I consider to be inherently limited to propaganda or miseducation. There is no political practice whatsoever. There is analysis, supposedly, which, since it is divorced from any viable political strategy, is just tendentious ideology. Platypus is the dead left, reduced to mere trafficking in misunderstood ideas, which serve only to justify in a crackpot way what are capitalist politics and policies, to a very limited audience of fanboys and fangirls. In Platypus, we are trying at the level of ideas to clear ideological obstacles to a real proletarian socialist movement. It is an inherently limited project. We are addressing the left, which is of course a petty bourgeois milieu. By contrast, my campaign is taking on the practical tasks of laying some kind of foundation for a proletarian socialist movement in politics. As I have said repeatedly, this will necessarily look like anarchism, or like grassroots Long March Maoism. So be it. But unlike the anarchists, we don't fetishize social action and oppose political action, the eventual struggle for state power and building a party to achieve it, on principle. Unlike the Maoists, we won't tail after supposedly progressive or working class capitalist politics, which again has clearly led nowhere but capitalist politics since the 1970s. Similarly, however, we're leftists, petty bourgeois radicals, might want to serve as potential cadre of what to actually be socialist must become a working class movement. We're not there yet. The 20th century leaves a lot of treacherous debris and unexploded ordnance. From the disintegration of Marxism and of proletarian socialism, I recognize that we are beginning today from scratch, but we have to avoid the traps awaiting the ignorant or the unwary. It's my opening gambit.
All right, thank you. And with time to spare, all right. So it's clear that Chris stands by all his original texts, which is fine, and that. So I will just say two things. That what you how you characterized Alexander could also be a fair characterization for you because you deal with students, yes? Or are you out there actively organizing the working class in the Communist or Socialist Party?
Well, we are dealing with working class people in the campaign. That's right.
Okay, how many?
Yeah, don't know.
Like
you
where?
Mean how many cadre? How many
I mean,
organizers?
no, I mean, like you have platypus meetings.
Oh yeah.
My understanding association is a student based, or at least originally.
That's platypus.
It's in it's platypus. Yeah. So I'm just curious if you have time going on, how that project is that you've outlined.
Okay, so platypus is.
Yeah. But no, I'll just three things that I have, and then you can either respond to those or I'll turn it over to Alexander. Just on that, and also it still seems that your understanding of what happened on October 7th in the history heretofore seems to be largely in line with what the Israeli state would say, which is still sad that that's the case. But that's a kind of an empirical question that we'll put to the side. I'm going to step back here because people want to hear what Alexander has to say. So, Alexander, do you want to go ahead and give your initial response?
Yes, certainly.
And if it gets yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll open up and then we'll go back and forth. Well, I'll start off by outlining, in case anybody's unfamiliar with it, my own general perspectives, and then respond to some of the points that Chris raises in his opening statement. First of all, the crisis facing certainly us in Britain, and I would also argue the crisis facing anybody who regards themselves as a communist or socialist inside the United States, is a crisis of class consciousness. And that is a crisis which goes back, in my view, to at least the confusion and chaos of the 1960s, the splits in the international communist movement, and also the I would say misunderstandings that arose through the reform period of welfare capitalism. Certainly this is true in Britain. I think less true in the United States, because the process that took place here in Britain called itself at various different points through the Labour Party a form of socialism, and was heavily associated with a sort of pseudo tripartite arrangement with the trade union movement, with its leadership being semi-incorporated, at least at various stages, into the functioning of the state, which acted as a manager for industrial relations. This was portrayed by many as a form of socialism. It is, via the different nationalized industries, including the National Health Service, regarded as still by certainly older workers in this country as a form of socialism. And it also left a huge indentation to this day within the consciousness of the leftist intelligentsia, who orbits this idea to this day. In fact, no matter what people call themselves in Britain, and I believe this is true to a large extent in the United States as well, the default position is to go back to or try to get back to something that looks like the welfare capitalist period, because this is the living experience of at least our parents' generation or grandparents' generation of the Great Reform period. So whether somebody calls themselves in Britain a Trotskyite or a social democrat or a radical social democrat or even an anarchist at various different stages, the politics default back to welfare capitalism again. And my own analysis of certainly with regard to Britain, I think the situation in the United States is analogous to a certain degree, but I think that there is some certain differences which we can get into. We are in Britain, the oldest imperialist country. We are suffering from, therefore, all of the, to steal Tara's show title, the morbid symptoms of that period, which is an advanced level of social disintegration, and a very deliberate and calculated attempt by the ruling class to destroy class consciousness. My way of putting it is that they have tried their absolute best to push the consciousness of the working class back below even being a class in itself,
Yes.
never mind a class
Right.
for itself. Whereas in actual fact, if we go by the definition of the proletariat that we should be using, I think, which is all those who cannot survive without the selling of their labor, then in actual fact, numerically speaking, the proletariat in both Britain and the United States has never been bigger. But the actual position of the proletariat with regard to its ability to enforce even the most basic of class demands has not, I would argue, been weaker in British terms since the immediate period after the 1926 general strike. And a big part of that is the confusion and chaos that reigns within that which is referred to as the collective left, which, although it tries, and I have been part of various different attempts to build socialist alternative groups within the trade union movement, build broad left movements within the trade union movement. I was a small, and I would regard it as relatively unimportant part of the Corbyn project. And all of these things revealed was a massive weakness in the sense that the field of struggle was automatically limited by respectability politics, by bourgeois parliamentarism, a deference to bourgeois parliamentarism bordering on an obsession, and to a large degree also a large amount of pro-Western chauvinism. And this shows itself in various different ways. I think it shows itself through an inability to show real solidarity with any national liberation movement, be that those who will be under discussion tonight, such as Hamas or Hezbollah, but also national liberation trends such as those that exist in the Sahel states, the long Bolivarian revolution process in Venezuela, the process in Nicaragua. The British left has shown a chronic inability to show solidarity with any of these in any meaningful sense when they come under sustained attack by the ruling class. And when they come under sustained attack by the ruling class, they throw their hands in the air and run away, usually declaring that the target of British ruling class aggression is a horrible dictatorship, and we would be better off without it. We saw this, in my view, disgraceful process when it came to the war on Libya. The left essentially agreed with the propaganda of the ruling class and ran and hid. The same was true of the war on Syria. And again, the left completely surrendered the field and ran away, certainly in Britain. And it happens time and time again. All the ruling class needs to do is to wave the scarecrow of dictatorship, and the left completely surrenders any attempt at solidarity or even meaningful opposition to the warmongering of the British ruling class. I would argue that the same is true in the United States. Now, to round out and bring us back to the question of the urgent question facing us in the imperial core nations, which is that the working class in Britain, the United States, France, Germany, and the other countries that were the welfare capitalist countries after us drubbing in the class war, really for over 40 years. I think in the US terms, it might even be longer. And the question comes back to, how do we build again? And in my view, where the project that I and others are seeking to build here in Britain goes beyond just the theoretical, but that is vital, because unless communists have a clear theoretical understanding of starting with the Marxist classics, being able to actually think and analyze in a dialectical materialist manner, then we stand no chance of actually standing up to all the propaganda and the lies and the deliberate seeding of confusion within the class the ruling class will attempt to do. We need thinking worker theoreticians who can go into their communities and workplaces, analyze the news of the day or the development in the workplace, and give it back to the working class, again, in their workplaces and communities in a manner that is understandable to them. This is, of course, my interpretation of this derives ultimately from Gramsci's analysis of the intellectuals, what is an intellectual and what isn't. And in my view, that, of course, following Gramsci, we need to vastly expand what is regarded as intellectual and what is not. We have allowed the definition of intellectual to be sort of a glasses-wearing pencil pusher for far too long, and the actual intellectuals are found in many working class communities. They are the trusted, unofficial leaders and teachers in a particular community. It is the job of communists at this stage to go out, speak with them, bring them into our educational process if we possibly can, and also have a two-way process of learning how to communicate with the class again. Marxism has been in a academic and student ghetto for longer than I have been alive. It says, I do not fool myself. We are largely irrelevant to 90% plus of the working class. And what most workers regard as Marxism is a cartoon drawn by the ruling class, but which sadly some people who call themselves Marxists choose to participate in anyway.
That's right.
So we are in a situation where we need to go back, and this is where I actually agree with Chris. We need to go back to the drawing board. We need to analyze what has gone wrong over the entire post-World War II period. I think we're probably going to argue about what we think has gone wrong, but I think we can agree that quite a lot has. And we need to reconnect Marxism with the working class again, at least to recruit a core of, call them worker intellectuals, worker militants, who can form the solid basis for the rebirth of a actual communist politics again. Because all of the attempts that I myself have been a part of, and nothing teaches like failure, I think, over the last 25 years since I first became politically active.
Alexander, you've been going about 9 minutes.
It's all been a failure. Okay, I'll sum up. Let's be honest, I will be honest, it's all been a failure, and it has to be learnt from properly and adapted to. And we need to adapt to the conditions that actually face us, not that which we wish that we were facing. So what we hope we can do tonight is have a debate on the basis of our understanding of certain realities and challenges, and not the fantasia that most of the left in Britain and the United States lives in. I'll conclude my comments there.
Great. So first of all, my campaign for a socialist party has that basic orientation of trying to reach people in their existing self-organization, which, but I also agree that it's at a very rudimentary state, and that a lot of it is captured by capitalist politics, and I would include the existing labor unions as really implicated in that. I'll quote the dreaded Trotsky, which is that he thought in the era of imperialist decay, if the labor unions are not led by communists, then they are just appendages of the state, of the capitalist. And I agree. And I think that it's long since been the case that in the UK and in the United States, that the labor movement is not at all fit to task. It's not fit to task as the basis for a socialist movement. It's also not fit to task at a more basic liberal level of class struggle, meaning the class in itself, like just collective bargaining. In the United States, the unions have mostly degenerated into like law firms, basically, litigation operations. They do very little actual organizing, and they certainly don't do any community organizing to support the labor movement in the way that would be necessary. Now, so to come back to the question of imperialism. So my criticism of leftist anti-imperialism is that it's liberal anti-imperialism. It's petty bourgeois anti-imperialism. It's what Hobson was for Lenin. That anti-imperialism today is basically in a kind of opposition to monopoly capital and finance capital on the part of the petty bourgeoisie, who are the big capital. So it's small capital against big capital. And the working class can also have a petty bourgeois horizon of activity in politics. And it can have what is essentially a kind of liberal anti-imperial. I think it's largely the point, meaning we already have, in the United States anyway, we have like libertarian anti-imperialism, like Rand Paul. We have Bernie Sanders anti-imperialism. We have the Squad, anti-imperialism. That's what anti-imperialism is. It's basically a policy dispute. So in your opening remarks, Tara, I agree that imperialism is not a policy. It's not what the government does or doesn't do. It's a historical condition of capitalism. And most people deal with imperialism as a policy. So they oppose war as imperialist, or they oppose supporting Israel through arms shipments as imperialism, as if Switzerland or Norway are not imperialist countries, even though they don't do those things. Or maybe they do some of those things, but not like the United States does, or Britain does. So I agree that imperialism is a kind of analytical category of a historical stage of capitalism. But I see anti-imperialism on the left as being no different from a kind of petty bourgeois or even capitalist alternative policy anti-imperialism. So I see, for instance, Bernie Sanders is friendly towards Cuba. Historically was friendly towards the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But what he offers is an alternative capitalist policy. He doesn't offer it's not like working class with
Sorry, Chris, may interject just a moment, because I think that we would all be in agreement about how crappy that stuff is. Yeah. But I want to talk about, but your point has been that, and I think to quote you, Marxism is not anti-imperialism, children. Yeah. So
maybe I've said that in a podcast.
That I'm not saying like I've heard you say that like other places.
Let me say this: Marxism is not.
So what I would say, like, if you could clarify that, because I'm pretty sure that Alexander would disagree. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the idea that it's a mistake to assume that Marxism, or and you can distinguish between the politics theory. I'll let you do that. Is not to make that synonymous with anti-imperialism, I believe is a statement that you've made a couple of times.
So what I would, just to clarify, Marxism is not anti-imperialism because Marxism is not anti-capitalism. There's capitalism, there's a lot of anti-imperialism. That's completely undialectical. Meaning, what the petty bourgeoisie, what the petty bourgeois radicals will discover is that there's no greater engine for capitalism than the working class itself, and that's why they reject the working class ultimately. I always tell my students, if I gave a very compelling look at Davos and convinced all of the billionaire capitalists that we should do communism and not capitalism, that would not be enough to bring about socialism. That would not be a way of overcoming capitalism at all. And the opposition that the billionaires who became communists would face would be the workers themselves. Meaning, it's the kind of, again, I feel like the Marxists don't even get into this. Like, they don't even lay the foundation for a historical materialist understanding of capitalism. So instead, it's sentimental. It's anti-capitalism because capitalism is screwing us over, or it's anti-imperialism because imperialism is committing atrocities. It has nothing to do with the struggle for socialism at all, other than as petty bourgeois socialism. So that's my point of saying such things, is just to step to one side. It's not about, like, first of all, the other thing that we need to acknowledge, nobody is pro-imperialist. Hardly anyone is pro-capitalist. Meaning, if you ask them, they're like, no, we don't accept what Marxists say about capitalism, let alone imperialism. They would say, it's not capitalism, it's the free market, it's liberal democracy. That's what they would say. They would say capitalism, that's like a Marxist idea. It's not capital. And they similarly say that they're against imperialism. All the capitalist politicians in the UK and the United States would say that they're anti-imperialist. So what? It's rhetoric.
Yes, but the point is that we're trying to get clarification on what your point is, not everybody else's this point.
Right.
Alex, but I think if you could, just because before we move on, Alexander, you want to say something to that, please?
Well, I think that the again, it's like I have a point of disagreement with Chris and a point of agreement with Chris. I think where Chris says that most leftism that calls itself anti-imperialist is actually, well, a form of essentially petty bourgeois moralism, which I think is what you're saying, Chris. In my experience with the left in Britain, that is correct, because they focus focus on developing what Lenin wanted when he wrote Imperialism, which is a thoroughgoing and systemic analysis of imperialism as a distinct and natural development of capitalism, which is the move from commodity production to financialization, the merger of money and industrial capital to finance capital, and the way that creates a new phase of the system. So yes, most of the characters you find on the anti-war left in Britain and the United States are basically saying this is bad stuff. This is morally bad. This is,
Which is true.
this is. It is true, but it doesn't take us anywhere.
Right.
But here's the point. Here's the point where I would disagree with what you said. I mean, for many people it's a way in, but for communists it should be that we should be looking to then bring people much further. We need to bring people towards a systematic understanding, which is that let's take if we're trying to do politics in, shall we say, Glasgow, for instance, if you're trying to engage in working struggles here around housing, around labor rights and stuff like that, the imperialism affects all of those things, because imperialism is a system which isn't just bad foreign policy. It's realization of absolutely everything. The integration of the banks and the hedge funds, pension funds into the ownership of everything. The reason why housing privatization goes on, why the social housing stock is constantly diminished and destroyed, that itself is a symptom of imperialism, because imperialism is capitalism in its most degenerate and parasitic form, where it's no longer in the phase of British industrial capitalism in the early to middle 19th century, or American industrial capitalism in the mid 19th, maybe mid 20th century, where it was a predominantly industrial commodity producing economy and could be argued at a certain stage to be playing a relatively progressive role. That's all gone now, working class internally as well. And so we have to bring home the understanding that imperialism isn't just, the bombing of oppressed people in the neo-colonial world. It is brought right back home again in the form of the systematic attacks on the working class, the driving of wages down for 40 plus years, in the sense that real wages have not improved at all. Yep. The constant deindustrialization, the merger of the banking system and the state and the central bank into one, almost. There was something somewhat completed, I would argue, by the 2008 crisis and everything that flowed from that. This is all imperialism. This is all, and most of the left does not put it in those terms. And this is why I would say we should have an instinctive solidarity with the oppressed peoples of the world, because they are our natural allies against this parasitic and vampiric system, because we have a shared interest with them in taking it apart. And I'll just conclude on this point. We have a shared interest in ending the ability of the banking giants and hedge fund giants and all the other characters, systems, institutions which exist with the City of London, Wall Street, etc., in their ability to extract or hyper exploit, shall we say, labor in the neo-colonial world and resources in the neo-colonial world. We have an interest in building an alliance with those people to take down our own ruling class.
Well, I certainly agree with. So let's take the concrete example that you guys have focused on in terms of my writing, which is Israel-Palestine, and my understanding of it. So my understanding of it, as I said in my opening remark, is that I was horrified at the October 7th attack because of what I knew Israel was going to do in response, much more than I was horrified by the attack itself. The empirical facts, be what they may, some civilians were targeted in some way by some Palestinians under that rubric of Hamas leadership, and that's just simply something that Marxists would never support. It's as simple as that. And so, now, of course, the problem is the Israeli response, which is strategy, meaning it was a pressure tactic. They wanted to ignite a regional war, and force Israel to the bargaining table. And in some ways, I guess they've succeeded. We'll see. You know, that's why the whole point is that nothing can be conceded, otherwise you're, you know, rewarding terrorism, right? So my attitude, though, about Israel-Palestine, it's been an issue my whole life, of course. I'm born in 1970, so I only lived in the post-1967 world, let alone the post-1948 world. And really, the first Intifada was in the 1980s and was towards the end of the Cold War. And what I'd say is that what we've had in that situation, in terms of Palestinian struggle, is that an Arab nationalist movement was supported by the Soviet Union as part of a Cold War orientation. And the bankruptcy of that led to the rise of Islamism. And that's true not only among the Palestinians, but throughout the Arab and Muslim world, that there was a kind of left nationalism supported by the Soviet Union in the Cold War that failed miserably and was replaced by an Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas as an outgrowth of that. And, you know, whatever like human sympathy one can have with all of these things, from a political perspective, I see Hamas as an obstacle to all sorts of things, to a proper understanding of the world in the West. So I think that the degree to which the West, like, you know, Western left, feels the need to have solidarity with Hamas, I think that they're very much mistaken and disoriented in terms of the tasks here. But, you know, I mean, it's not like I think Bernie Sanders said, well, of course, Hamas must be destroyed. That is not my priority. That is not my concern. You know, like, that is just not on my radar, like, at all. And I will also say, you guys probably know this from watching some of my podcasts, I live in the Muslim world. I'm married to a Muslim. And he thought that the October 7th attack was Allah's punishment on Israel for violating Al-Aqsa. Sincerely. And so we have very, you know, many Muslim friends of all, you know, political persuasions. You know, he has a direct connection back to his home country of Malaysia. I understand the whole thing intimately. I understand the whole thing. And I have a long history of studying and paying attention to this issue. I'm anti-Zionist. I think that the anti-Semitism hysteria that brought down Jeremy Corbyn and that the right is trying to use in the United States is, of course, bullshit. You know, I'm just not, you know, I'm a leftist. I mean, it's as simple as that. But I've also seen how this issue has warped the mind of many would-be socialist, Marxist young people. And it's become their priority instead of what I think should be the priority, and call that Western parochialism. But I don't think the world history is hinging on Israel-Palestine. Now, Muslims do think that because of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa. But I don't think a socialist left should regard it this way.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, I don't. Obviously, this is a whole kettle of fish. I do find it interesting that you focus on the religiosity of Muslims and not Zionists and Christian Zionists and Ben Gvir and those types, because there's
I wrote about Huckabee being a Christian Zionist.
No. Let me finish,
right?
please. Just in terms of this, just in terms of the kind of the cut of the jib here. In terms of Islamism, they believe all these, you know, mystical religious things, and of course, some Muslims do, some Muslims don't. There's a whole variety, and I don't want to get into you know, who knows what better. I did live there for 2 years, so during the second Intifada, so I have some personal experience. Although I wasn't there as a researcher, I was there teaching, so it's a different thing. Yeah, that what I would say is that I think that I disagree that to dismiss that the focus on Israel Palestine or the sympathies for Hamas Hezbollah has perverted or has been in general a terrible thing for the younger generation. Of course, there's all kinds of nuance in there. I don't know what's in these people's minds. But what I would say is that, first of all, if you're anti-Zionist, you don't think there should be a state of Israel, because that's the whole project of Zionism, is the state of Israel. And the Greater Israel Project, what I think is why the United States is interested in Israel, is you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why they support Israel. So even if it's just the fact that if it wasn't for the United States doing what they do, Israel will not be able to do what they do. So there's a responsibility there, and a political one, whether it be moral or whatever. On the side of Hamas, yes. That I'll just table that for now. I will, if somebody's interested, I could point them to some interesting texts about the nuance of that history of that organization. Of course, people
not trying to demonize them.
Pick a particular act and then use that as a metonym to cast the whole movement, since I think that it switched from cultural to militant whatever. And the last point is that, on a second note, in a way, our feelings are kind of, I mean, they're not irrelevant, because we can decide what we want to support and what we want to talk to each other about. But the fact is that Hamas's popularity is not decreasing in Palestine; it's increasing, and they're not a stupid. They're not a stupid population.
Right.
So we have to at some point have to reckon with that. And I think I think that what happens in West Asia, I think American imperialism lives and dies in West Asia. So I think we should be very, that's just my critical
Can I make a little point here? This
Please.
is an important point. I think that if you look at Trump's policy, I think he's trying to integrate the United the policy with regards to the Middle East.
Yeah.
I think he is trying to change the U.S.'s orientation and dependence on the Middle East. Fundamentally, and I don't, I mean, it's as far as like all the fake debates around this stuff, like, does Israel have a right to exist, or whatever? Does Israel have a right to defend itself, and all this nonsense? Like, of course, I completely reject all of that stuff, all of that rationale. The issue with Hamas is, I think that I actually think that the October 7th attack was they were abandoning governing Gaza, and it was actually, like I said, to force Israel to negotiate, and it was also to become a political rather than a military force. In other words, they sort of expended whatever military option they had, and now they're trying to parlay it into a political position. And by the way, the Trump administration is open to that. They're offering them clemency.
No, and I would agree with you on that. That it's that the idea that it was just some sort of let's go and rampage, that's silly.
No, it's
but again, what I find interesting is because of all the stuff you talked about. I mean, we're all aware of what's been going on over there since that happened. But the fact that after all of that, if the polls are to be trusted at all, that their popularity has gone up. To me, I think that's something that
what they've pushed for is Barghouti. They want to be the president of the PA, and he's not Hamas, but he's also not Fatah.
Yeah,
and
he's
so
still in prison, though. They can never let him out.
They want him out, and but they want him right, and so they want a reformed Palestinian Authority. So does the Trump administration. And so it's, I think that, again, it's not as simple. I prefer to look at it politically rather than moralistically. And at the same time, of course, the horror of the Israeli...
No, I prefer the political as well, but,
But at the end of the day, after all the people have died, there's still going to be politics on the other side of it.
Yeah.
And Hamas is going to be a political player. Israel is still going to exist. I was at student encampment protests here in Chicago, young people, and they were organized and informed by older people. And those older people did not disabuse them of their illusions. Their illusion was that this was the end of Israel. I was like, that is not happening. Like, if you think that your encampment is about bringing about the end of the state of Israel, maybe in 50 years, but not within any appreciable time frame. Like,
Well, yeah,
it's just
no
not
no
happening right now.
encampment's going to do that. I mean,
Right? And they used the language, and I said, why are you calling the people that Israel has killed? Why aren't you calling them dead people? They were like, oh, no, it's disrespectful. You have to call them martyrs.
yeah, but who?
So they
I mean,
literally had 35,000 martyrs. The pamphlets were produced by Hamas. They downloaded them off the internet,
well,
and they were like, you disrespect the struggle if you say that they were just killed, that they're
well,
just
that's
dead.
that. Okay,
You have to
well,
call
that
them
we're getting
martyrs.
a bit the weeds about.
These are my students.
Yeah,
These
well,
are my
that's
students.
fine, but whether they use the word martyr or not is
No,
okay.
but it's
okay.
a bad political
Okay, but I
consciousness.
I just want to I want to exit myself here and give it over to Alexander.
That's why I use some of the rhetoric that I do.
Yeah, fair enough. Alexander, if you could respond to that, and also your understanding of the class analysis of the class analysis of Palestine in particular, Fatah, Hamas, and the characterization of them being just basically gangsters, and that we should not be putting our bread in that basket.
Well, first of all, I'll start by giving my perspective on the why British and US imperialism will back Israel absolutely to the bitter end. And that is historically rooted. It starts in, well, there are many different start dates, but let's, for the purpose of this, say the real change in British policy comes around about the 1890s, when they are looking to, I would say, pick over the corpse of the Ottoman Empire and carve out somewhere for that will be friendly to British interests and will help them project power into West Asia. That is behind the line of in the given or spoken by Sir Ronald Storrs, governor of Mandate, what was called Mandate Palestine. They wanted a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. Meaning, and if you're not familiar with Ulster, that's of course the still occupied, British occupied part of Ireland, the Irish Republicans call the occupied Six Counties, that had a Scottish Protestant population put into it many hundreds of years ago now, to make sure that they would be a bedrock for British control. Same plan was hatched, or similar plan was hatched for what was then called Palestine, in collaboration and a long-term collaboration with the Zionist movement, who also had their own agenda, which they were happy to work with the British Empire on that. The two sort of fell out with each other later on. But the general agenda is that the Israeli state, as it became, prior to that, the Zionist movement, would be a permanent barrier to any kind of Arab unity project, be that the admittedly flawed projects of Nasserism, of Syrian and Iraqi Baathism, of the various different Arab socialist groups that did exist for quite a long time post Second World War, prior to their significant decline in popularity following the counter-revolutionary destruction of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. The rise of Hamas, I think, has to be treated as a distinct phenomenon, and I reject Chris's blanket usage of the term Islamism, because I think that is a term which actually confuses more than it clarifies. There are many different types of groups which wear the label or which proclaim themselves to be some form of Islamic inspired organization. Hamas comes out of a particular reactionary tradition, there's no point denying that, that is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. But as I'm sure everybody watching this will understand, they're going through a series of political and military struggles does tend to somewhat change a group. And this group and Hamas became popular because of the corruption and degeneration of Fatah. Because of that, Hamas won an election in Gaza in particular in 2006, I believe it was, which was specifically then rejected by Tony Blair as Middle East peace envoy later on, and by the Bush administration, starting, of course, the siege on Gaza. Now, I give this as the foregrounding because I think it's important that we analyze each group on its own terms. We have to analyze Hamas in that light, in the light of them rejecting the very corrupt puppet regime of the PLA that's controlled by the US, by the British, and by Israel. British even train its police force. That's how they became popular, and that's why they retain their popularity. because they are seen correctly to stand against the Israeli control. Now, in terms of the politics of Hamas, of course, I, as a Marxist-Leninist, would not have much truck with any of it, because they are a theologically inspired group, albeit one that I would argue is a different kind of group than the likes of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc., who should be more properly analysed and understood as allies of British imperialism, US imperialism, and Israel, because that's upon whose side they fight an awful lot of the time. To go back to the point about why is this issue central to us as communists in the West, it's an important issue because this is how the US empire and the British empire, which are umbilically linked together now, as is most of Western Europe. There's an awful lot of, we can maybe get into this later, with when that much capital passes back and forth each year, that's an unbreakable alliance. So they have an interest in maintaining Israel in order to make sure that the kind of politics that are promoted amongst in West Asia are those derived from the likes of the Saudis, the Qataris, the UAE, etc. That's who will be running Syria as essentially, along with the Turks. That's who will be the primary influence or are the primary influence over the PLA. That's who the Trump administration probably want to have primary influence over a rebuilt Gaza. They're collaborators with US power. I disagree that Trump is aiming for an exit from West Asia. First of all, I think what Trump says on any particular given day tends to change depending upon what happens the next day. But I would say that also, even if Trump were 100% sincere about wanting to reorient US power around a defensive or an advance of US interests in the Western Hemisphere, there are many entrenched parts of the Washington, D.C. bureaucracy in what is referred to as the blob and wider ruling class interests, which would act to prevent that. There's an awful lot of capital riding on US, British, Western European investments via the Gulf tyrannies and other places that they want to see protected. So even if Trump wants to pull back a little bit, there are too many institutional barriers to him doing that. So I would disagree with Chris on that point as well.
Right. I mean, so going back to the
before you start, I just want to say that we're at 1 minute and 18. No, 1 minute, 1 hour and 18 minutes. So if we stick to our 2 hours, we have what do we have? 42 minutes. So we're doing good.
Okay.
Please continue.
Great. So my attitude about what happened around 2005, 2006, it was the so-called unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, meaning it was the removal of the settlement and the kind of embargo, containment, Gaza. And my attitude toward, now Israel's going to bomb Gaza as if it's a foreign country. In other words, I saw this as a horrible development. But nonetheless, it was the basis for Hamas establishing an area of its own control. And again, I'm not here to demonize Hamas, but or to get into the nuances of Zionism. There are various varieties, but rather to just note that there was Arab nationalism historically, and it was generally by Islamism, starting in the 70s, and certainly by the 80s and recent era. And just to acknowledge that the so-called left nationalism, or what is sometimes referred to as Arab socialism, failed. It failed miserably. And Islamism doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't just come out of like the Muslim background of the region. It is a political movement, and it comes in response to the failure of another political movement. And I don't think there are many leftists, there are many Marxists who generally would prefer kind of Arab nationalism to Islamism. I don't really care one way or the other. So the real question is, we really need to get into, which is so-called national liberation struggles. And that's a 1930s concoction of Stalin. I would say. It's not Lenin. It's not Lenin's position, and I would say it's not really a Marxist position. I would say that there's a difference between the struggle against national oppression and the idea of national liberation struggles per se. Meaning, national liberation struggles might be, part of an objective process of history. I understand them as being about conflicts within capitalism. I do not see them as inherently helping the working class achieve socialism, either in the developing world or in the metropolitan sort of overdeveloped world. The kind of the kind of and world of the imperialist core. I don't see national liberation struggles per se as aiding in the working class struggle for socialism at a world scale, either, again, in those countries. And indeed, what you had in the 50s and 60s was an alliance between the communist parties in the Middle East with Arab nationalist regimes. And invariably, it led to the crushing communist parties by the nationalists. So insofar as there was any kind of socialist movement with any kind of working class base in the Middle East, it was destroyed. And it was destroyed through an alliance with the nationalists. And so I see, the PFLP, for example, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they think of themselves as Marxists and as socialists, as communists. They are in a common front with, they operate jointly with Hamas. So they have a conception of what they're doing, right? So they see Hamas as the national liberation movement, and that they are allied with as communists. And I wrote about this as well. They put aside their ideological differences with Hamas until after the national liberation struggle is achieved, and then they expect that the class struggle will break out after that. But in the meantime, they subordinate very self-consciously to the national liberation struggle. And I think that is anti-Marxist and anti-socialist and anti-working class. And there's a long history for that.
All right. I just have a few things to flag, and then I'm going to turn over to Alexander. In terms of the fall or the failure of Arab nationalism and the rise of Islamism, that, of course, and I'm sure you would agree, there was a lot of external factors involved in that, in terms of,
Sure.
And I don't want to get into like the Arab joke state, the Gulf joke states, and Wahhabism and all this stuff, but obviously a divided kind of balkanized or whatever fiefdoms obviously are easier to control and to play off one another and all of that. And so to look at the connection
fault. It's imperialism's
and the external one.
It's imperialism's
Sorry?
fault. It is imperialism's fault.
I didn't say it was imperialism's fault.
I would say that ultimately imperialism is responsible.
But hold on. So I just wanted to flag that in case someone wants to, just to flag it, just because, the second thing is that in terms of, and I'm assuming Alexander will get on this, is that the idea that national liberation and whatnot is it's not clear what that means for the working classes there, and especially the connection with the working classes here. Of course, a lot of that depends on what kind of leadership comes in. But if you're able to get control, have some more control of your economy and not be just kind of a mono economy or in some sort of natural resource ghetto, and you're able to have better economic development, I think that Alexander's flagged this before, that if you look at just the mortality rates or education rates, right, with all the crap that was going on in those Arab nationalist experiments, real material progress was managed. That may not be, didn't end up in socialism, but to push that away is a bit maybe too convenient. But again, depends on what kind of level of abstraction you're discussing things at. So I just wanted to flag those two things, and there was another one, but I can't remember. So I'm gonna get out of it now and pass it over to Alexander. And we have 35 minutes, so we're doing well.
Well, on the point first about national liberation struggles, and here is a point that I disagree with Chris on. I would say that the examples that have been cited are, of course, led to a certain amount of national liberation in terms of, and I'll clarify this to make it concrete, to follow on from what Tara was saying. In terms of the imperialist control over countries, what they mostly seek to do is to attune them to the needs of the imperial core economies. They seek to turn them into sites of raw resource extraction, or areas where there can, in the old period of imperialism, imperial core countries' products could be sold to them for large profits. Now it's more about extraction and also outsourcing of production, sometimes to the subordinated nations. So in a strange way, the imperialism has sort of done a turnaround where it went from sending the products there to producing them there. Now that's what, countries that are dominated in the region will end up being. That will end up being the case, such as the now so-called liberated Syria will end up serving that role. I'm fairly sure. But to go back to the point about national liberation, the point about and subordination of the class struggle, or as Mao used to put it, subordination of the secondary contradictions behind the primary contradiction. Drawing from the experience that the Communist Party of China had in the liberation struggle in the 20s, particularly the 1930s and 40s. It is undoubtedly the case that in that example, it was the correct decision to actually try and reach some kind of accommodation with the Chinese bourgeois nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek in order to successfully resist Japanese imperialism. This was something, of course, that Chiang Kai-shek didn't want anything to do with, and had in the end signed only a temporary agreement at gunpoint, and he was held hostage by his own generals. Now, the point about the subordination of the class struggle to the national struggle, Chris cited in his contribution that this leads to disasters for the communists particularly in West Asia. Also, I would say it led to it contributed towards the suppression of communist parties in South America as well, to a certain extent. This is not something which does not come without risk. I don't think anybody would argue that. What is the case, though, is that where there is a situation where even the development of a proletariat itself is restricted by foreign domination, it is entirely correct to actually prioritize a struggle to rid the nation of that imperial control, even just in order that an industrial economy can grow and the proletariat can grow. Because when so-called economic development under the auspices of imperialism leads to distortion, it leads to one-sided economies emerging that are just based around resource extraction. It leads to the promotion by imperialism of all kinds of reactionary ideologies, including, of course, reactionary Islamic-inspired groups, reactionary Christian groups, etc., reactionary dead-end fake nationalism, etc. So this comes with risks, but it is a risk that I would argue it is appropriate to judge and sometimes take if it leads to the ridding of or the substantial reduction of imperialist influence over a particular country. It was a risk, I think, worth taking in the struggle in Algeria. It's a risk worth taking in the struggles to liberate African nations. Nobody is going to claim that the African nations were then put on a path to immediate socialism. It led to a lot of failures and a lot of backward steps as well. But the removal of the influence and the domination of the imperialist countries over the subordinated nations is a crucial stage. It does not automatically put one on a path to socialism, but it is a necessary stage of the struggle to go through. And from my point of view, from the Marxist-Leninist point of view, it is consistent with the analysis of Lenin, but also, I know Chris will disagree with this, the analysis of Stalin and Mao as well. And I think that it is borne out by looking at those countries that have managed to liberate themselves and managed to at least build an industrial base that is strong enough to endure and actually expand production to the point where a stronger proletariat can emerge that will give us a chance in the future, or give those people a chance in the future to have a stronger fight for socialism. And that, in my view, makes the gamble worth taking. I will not argue that it is a gamble that is risk-free. It evidently is, but it is something which I think is a tactical decision for people in these countries to make, and a correct one that has been made.
All right. Fundamental disagreement, finally.
Excellent.
Which is, I don't believe in national paths of development. I don't think that capitalism develops on a national basis. I think that if it did, really what developed was bourgeois social relations on a national basis, but then you're talking about the 15th and 16th and maybe 17th centuries. But that certainly in the industrial era, there's no national development. So that gets us to what you regard as like my Trotskyism, my Western parochialism, et cetera, and also where the charge of being really comes from, which is my prioritization of the proletarian struggle for socialism in the metro core capitalist countries, because I don't think that the path of development, nor will it be like capitalism in each country achieving a kind of stage of socialist development. I do not think, for instance, that the Soviet Union or China needed to proletarianize in the way that they did. In other words, I think that it's fine that they did what they did, fine. However, look at what cost. The 5-year plan, the crash industrialization, the Great Leap Forward. These things were just historically not necessary to achieve socialism in the world. They were not. And I think that it's warped Marxism into a national developmental plan. And a lot of leftists in the developing world became Marxists because they really were just national developmentalists. That's what they were. If you read Nehru, has a pretty sophisticated understanding of Marxism. But he was not a socialist. He was not a Marxist. He was a national capitalist, is what he was. And, if you look at the history of India between then and now, it's kind of like, okay, so we're waiting for India to become like a Western European country? Is that what we're expecting to happen? That's never going to happen. I mean, Western European countries aren't what they used to be. The United States isn't what it used to be. It's combined and uneven development means contradictory development. I understand capitalism. I mean, you mentioned some steps forward, some steps back. I do not see the world developing. Like, I don't see the third world or the peripheral world catching up. I don't see that really being the case. And China is the one example that seems to, throw a monkey wrench into what I'm saying. And yet I also think that the capitalist development of China in recent decades is and will produce a political crisis there. And it will produce a political crisis there faster than it will in the United States or Western Europe, in fact. So I don't expect China to lead the world to socialism. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think that they will succumb to imperialism. I think in many ways they already have.
All right. So if I'll just jump in and jump out, try to jump in and jump out quickly. You mentioned that you don't think there's such a thing as national capitalism, but yet, as you may have noticed, that you're talking is strewn with geographical terms. It only makes sense geographically. So how do you make sense of uneven development, geographical uneven development, so kind of like David Harvey, Neil Smith type of stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, obviously there's political geographies that interact with economic ones. And we kind of have, maybe we're still maybe in a lag, that we're in this kind of conception of the nation state. And there's been a long debate about, if we have to think about, a super scale or a local scale, and you have some geographers talking about planetary capitalism and all kinds of things going on.
Right.
Geographers love scale. Like, what scale do we focus on?
Right.
But how do you make sense of then the relationship and the contradictions, or the tensions between a political geography and an economic geography, and the uneven development that ensues from that? And at the same point, say, well, I don't believe in, or I don't find it useful to think in terms of national development when our countries with national governments and there's still that political geography, of course, that could be, weakening and whatnot. I just wanted to flag that, not as just an observation, not maybe really necessarily a question. And also, we can't know, we may never get to socialism, but we certainly won't know how we got there until we did. So I find I find it interesting when you can look back now, of course, from the vantage point of this point of history we are, and look back and be like, this was a mistake. This wasn't necessary. We could have gone X, Y, and Z. And of course, if I like to do that as well, but I find that a bit. I don't know if arrogance the right word. I mean, I can also be arrogant, but this idea that that's not going to get us to socialism, that wasn't necessary. Well, how the F do you know? We're not there yet.
Well, I don't know. I'm pretty confident that we don't need to industrialize the whole world in order to achieve socialism. That's just, I'm like, production is very unevenly distributed in the world. And we would have to also discover through the class struggle today just where the global centers of capitalist production actually are. Meaning it's not just to be assumed that it lines up with
then I'm really going to shut up. There's the geography of production, but of course there's production, there's distribution, there's exchange, realization, all these types of, that fantastic thing maybe you've used with your students, like you have the Starbucks cup and all the stuff that goes into Starbucks and the distribution and all that. It's quite global. But if we only focus on production, that's also, but sorry, I'm going to take my hat out now.
Of course. I mean, I just, I think of, we've talked about like the Gulf states. And, so where do the workers in the Gulf states come from? They come from Bangladesh. So is that the proletarianization of Bangladesh? Kind of, also not. And, the mass migration that we see in the world, especially post-2008 and now accelerated post-COVID, is a redistribution of the global working class, meaning, the United States and Western Europe are absorbing a lot of the developing world's working class. That's a reality. And you have a kind of gutting and collapsing of countries in Latin America, the Middle East. You just have like a kleptocracy and an ultra poor kind of plebeian mass, and then in many countries the way they deal with that is to make them all soldiers in the military, which is how like
or ICE is, that's the salary.
Well, you can do that in the United States too, but I'm thinking of like Pakistan or Egypt, that basically they keep a lid on things by having militaries that they don't really need. But that's the way you kind of warehouse the working class. In the United States, they warehouse the working class in the
okay. We're getting very kind of off field from the national thing.
The national development point is, look, politically, like juggling the political and the economic is always tricky. But politically, the United States, where I am, has an organic connection to the working class of the world through its own working class. There are literally workers here from every country in the world who have a direct family, organic connection, are in constant communication with their families back in their home countries. I'm an internationalist, and I really think we've wasted 100 years on national paths to capitalist development and the struggle for socialism. And I think that it's absurd. It was absurd then. It's absurd now. That would be, it's a very abstract level.
Okay. Well, on that, that's a good note. That's a good way. That's a good point to pivot back. Alexander, try to defend your absurdity.
No, I mean, I'm not even
and the absurdity of your party.
I'm not even sure.
Well, I will first of all start off with stating that which many will understand anyway. Obviously, I entirely disagree with Chris's analysis of the question of the 5-year plans and industrialization of the Soviet Union, Without that, then the Soviet Union would have been conquered and destroyed by Nazi Germany. There is no doubt about that. And also the progress in China that has been made since under the Deng Xiaoping period and afterwards is made on the foundation built in the revolutionary period. Without the destruction of the old comprador bourgeoisie and their influence over China, without the destruction of the influence of the landlord class, no development would have been possible whatsoever. Now, as to the current condition of China, and I'll answer this one first, what I would call it is, at the moment, it is I would say, a contested position, meaning that there is within the Communist Party of China every form of opinion, from Maoists through to those who would describe themselves as out and proud devotees of Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. This produces a real struggle within the Chinese party that is reflected within the often contradictory statements made by Xi Jinping and the other Chinese leaders, who will say on the one hand that we respect the legacy of Mao Zedong, on the other hand, reform and opening up is an ongoing process and will never come to an end. And the contest there is not decided yet. There is much more to come, and it will be informed by the continued interaction of the Chinese party and the class struggle in China. And the Chinese working class will ultimately have the final say over which way the Chinese party goes and which way the Chinese state goes. I am not, and have not, well, I hope so. I am not and have not advocated for the point that China is now leading the new Comintern. The Chinese leadership has no interest in that,
right,
and will not do that. Nor, I think, should we look to that either.
Right.
I think that the role, I would say that China plays a progressive role to a certain extent by actually offering other countries a path to development which is much better than that which is offered by the engagement with the imperialists in terms of what the European Union, Britain, and the United States offer. The countries where Chinese investment has been heavy certainly see, I would argue, a greater degree of industrialization and a more balanced industrialization that has been seen than by, shall we say, the neo-colonial status that French and British imperialism condemned a lot of African nations to. But the struggle in China will go on and will ultimately, it is, of course, not for, we will have minimal influence over that unless, of course, we in the West actually manage to secure socialist development in our own countries. Yes. Then this is the thing that we can do most of all to actually stop the rampage of the British and American ruling class all over the world, is to focus upon building our forces here, building our forces to the point where we can do things like strikes that should designed to affect government policy. At the moment, we stand no chance of doing that. We stand no chance of doing that because of the relative weakness of our class's position in these countries. But to go back to the point about the development of the work, depending upon your preferred terminology, the neo-colonial world, third world, developing world, etc. The more that these nations develop to the point where they have a larger proletariat, the more that they are able to actually, shall we say, force better terms of trade on the imperialist powers, the actual better it is both for them and us. And I will just elaborate on this. What has been built since the early 90s really is a system, is a globalized system of production and distribution, with the United States and Western Europe at the center of it. The production, of course, industrial production outsourced to an ever greater degree to the developing world or neo-colonial world, with the rules of the game enforced via IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, set in London, and largely in London and Washington, with Brussels also playing a role. The principle of unequal exchange is embedded within that system. This is the reason why it was designed that way. It is now, of course, it has been much more profitable to employ somebody to make trainers in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh than it is to have the same thing done in Manchester or New York or Chicago. The system was built that way. The reason why we are seeing so much tension now emanating from the West towards what it regards as its rivals, China, Russia, Iran to a certain extent, India to a certain extent, though I would regard the position of the Indian ruling class at the moment as very weak with regard to whether they were determined to follow a national development plan or not, or just make themselves into a manufacturing appendage of the United States and the Europeans. But the reason why there is such tension, the reason why there is the threat of war hangs over us, the reason why there is so much hysteria emanating from London and Washington is that this system, which has existed built on the unipolar world order, is breaking down. You see countries able to enforce better terms of exchange with the imperial core nations. This, on top of the gigantic crisis caused by what was in essence, I would argue, a vast overproduction of capital itself in 2008, has led to an ever-increasing amount of aggression from the United States, from Britain, and from Western Europe. This lies behind the Ukraine war. It lies behind the very contradictory position of both the Europeans and the Americans towards China, both wanting to maintain their interests there, whilst also wanting to break the rule of the Communist Party and have it reduced to pure comprador rule. I don't think they'll succeed, but history will come to that. So, just to conclude my thoughts on this, the industrial development and the development of the proletariat, I would argue, is important for socialism. It is important for the building of a socialist state to have a strong working class there, but also a politicized working class there, and the degree of politicization that continues to expand. The fate of the Soviet Union, and I'll conclude on this point, proves that the material advancement by itself is not enough. There must also be a political advancement as well. The fatal flaw in Khrushchevite revisionism and in Dengist thought is a crude materialism. To believe that if we material advance the working class, therefore things will get stronger. That is not the case. What must also happen in every country is that there is a politicization to the point where the worker intellectual can challenge the party boss and expect and be able to win the argument. That is what was behind, ultimately, Mao's old slogan, bombard the headquarters, because that's what ultimately one would have to do to stop the reemergence of bureaucratic pro-capitalist layers, which ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union and are there within China at the moment. And it's them who, by the way, the United States counts on. The United States, the British count on that layer ultimately succeeding. And the struggle in those in all of the countries that have gone through revolutions is for the expansion of the politicized working class, the class-conscious working class, who understand what I would argue Mao understood, which is that after the revolution, the class struggle intensifies, and that remains the case to this day.
All right. So we are. Thank you, Alexander. We are nearing. We're nearing the end. I just want to thank you again. It's been really rich. I've been so engrossed that I haven't checked comments. Sorry, people. But I'm sure they're conversing with each other.
No death threats so far.
I'm sure it's lovely chatting there. Anyway. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I just want to say, because we and I appreciate Chris's opening gambit, because we've been giving it to him, so it's only fair that he volley that back to us. Alexander has not talked about the idea that Stalinism is, what was it? It's the right-wing
Marxism.
Right-wing Marxism and the slippery slope to fascism and the hangman of the revolution, and that you may call yourself a Stalinist, but you're probably not, etc., etc. That's out of my wheelhouse, like I said. Alexander's going to come back. Hold on, wait. I'm going to wrap up. Alexander's going to come back. He's going to try to Stalin pill me. We're going to do that before the end of the year. So I remain Stalin curious, but I grew up, I'm the same generation you are. So there's certain things you hear and you're like, whoa, but he's going to try that. But I want to just plug a thing, because we did do a show on I don't know if it was a paper you did or as a podcast or something about ACP. There was something, but we did a. I'm sorry, it's hard to say it with you here. We did a bad take on Cutrone's critique of neo-Stalinism. I'll plug that. You can go check it out. It's with Alexander. And, maybe we'll get back to that. But why? We'll just pretend that wasn't there because we're getting along so well. So let's keep it up. We have 10 minutes. What I'd like to do is to split up between you two, and then we'll say our goodbyes until we meet again. And again, I just want to say that I really appreciate both of you doing this, and I think it's been worthwhile. I know I've found it generative. So, Chris, 5 minutes for you. You don't have to take all of it,
Right.
And then we'll end with Alexander, and then we'll go celebrate Guy Fawkes or whatever's going on in where you are. So 5 minutes for you, give or take.
Great, thank you. No, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify myself. I will also say that, the way you guys frame the discussions, the post-war left is dying, namely the post-World War II left is dying. But Alex, you also reached back to the time of the British General Strike, so nearly 100 years to the 1920s. I would also similarly say that there's been a real decline and crisis and ultimately absence of a proletarian socialist movement in the imperialist core metropolitan capitalist countries dating back to that time. So I don't think that it was really reversed. I think that a lot of setbacks occurred in the Popular Front era in the 1930s, and this is my Trotskyist background. I do think that was a period of the liquidation of Marxism, and that we still struggle with that. So I think that the left is beset by two memories that weigh on the brains of the living like a nightmare, which is the 1930s and the 1960s. So I think that it's not just the 1960s that did damage. I think that the 1930s did damage as well. And I understand the point about resisting Hitler, defeating Nazism. I understand. However, again, I'm less interested in that kind of ideological justification for Stalinism or the Soviet Union, in terms of what Stalin did was necessary to defeat the Nazis, because again, in 2025, it's unclear, the ultimate trajectory of all these things. So, there is, I've been accused, you mentioned the ACP, Tara. I've been accused by Carlos Garrido and others, Haas, as, being like a purist and, like the purism of Trotskyism and Western Marxism and this kind of thing. I don't think that it's a matter of purism. I think it's a matter of getting back down to brass tacks and also understanding that we can't take a lot for granted. We can take very little for granted, actually. And also to clarify the civil social organizing aspect of my current efforts, which go back not to the New Left and not to the 30s either, but rather to the Eugene Debs era, the Second International era. In other words, what did it actually take to build proletarian socialist parties in the core capitalist countries historically? And again, it's for me an open question whether the conditions have fundamentally changed. I'm not sure that they really have fundamentally changed, made it impossible to organize a movement and a politics, a party along those lines. But it was the one time in which it happened in the United States. And I don't think that it was just the first blush of industrialization. I think that there were other conditions and other practices. There were other things that were done that I think have not been done in 100 years, basically. And that we need to try to do some version of today. And that might be, again, a point of agreement, a point of disagreement. It might be a basis for meaningful disagreement, that we agree on that and we disagree over how to bring that about. But that is my basic perspective. So it's not about excluding people. It's not about excommunicating people. It's not about that. My basic point about Marxism these days is that while I do consider myself to be a Marxist, I also think that you can't bring Marxism in a kind of precipitous way, that Marxism has to be motivated by the actual condition of political and social struggle. Meaning, I think that a lot of what needs to be done now actually does not require Marxism as a theoretical understanding or justification. A lot of what needs to be done in terms of restoring the class in itself is essentially can be done from a like understanding of like, you know, basic association, like all sorts of things that have been undermined in
So you're no
capitalism.
longer the last Marxist? Is that the announcement? Do we have a scoop on that?
No, I am the last Marxist, but I also
I'm still
realize
some sort of Marxist. You don't need Marxism. Like, we're here, folks.
no. What I'm saying is, being like the last Marxist many years ago. It was semi-ironically, meaning, and as if that right. In other words, what would it even mean to be the last Marxist? So again,
You're a man of
I think
mystery.
that I am, you know, I was bitten by the Marxist mind virus, and you know, I'm indelibly Marxist. I will always be. I'm not sure how exactly to bring in Marxism for the tasks at hand, right? So I don't think that we can just have this sort of free Marxism or from the 50s or 60s, and we just plop it in. I don't think that works. So I would say that I'm very much a Marxist, but like all historical Marxists, I try to resist into a dogma or an ideology, right? Because I think we can end up deceiving our that way.
Oh, well, for sure. If only everyone could be as perfect as I. Yes.
Right.
No, my grandma always says that, or no, she's dead, but when you're pointing the finger, there's always three pointing back at you. Yeah. So, but of course, it's easier to point the finger. Anywho, were you done?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So thanks.
Alexander, to wrap up, your final comments for this rendition.
I will start off by saying that the defense we make, those of us who describe ourselves as Marxist-Leninists, of the Stalin period and the Soviet Union, of the Maoist period in China, is not historical fetishism or sort of building a Tumblr board or something like that. It is because we see the Marxism of this period as something to be read, analyzed, and learnt from. Which I think there are an awful lot of lessons in there which are pertinent to our current struggle, as there is, of course, in the original work of Marx, Engels, and Lenin themselves. The problem that we face, particularly in the Western world, because the advanced imperialist nations, as I think we agree on, do have all similar kind of characteristics rooted in the development of the economy towards a greater and greater degree of parasitism under the influence of late-stage imperialism. I see dialectical materialism, I see the Marxist-Leninist worldview as being important for the rebuilding of a communist party. And we are very much in the rebuilding stage, because as we were discussing in the period when we were talking about imperialism, what the working class is under attack by is not a single party. It's not a single dictator or monarch or something like that, or even Donald Trump himself.
Right.
I know that will upset any DSA people who are listening. It is imperialism as a system turned inwards to a continual attack on the working class. To be able to understand that and to build appropriate tactics and strategies to actually help in the process of rebuilding a working class movement that can, first of all, do the basics of defending itself, in my view, does require Marxism-Leninism. It requires the method of Marx, the method of Lenin, not a recitation of holy tomes. That is not what we are for. We are for the application of the method to analyze the current situation. We cannot say that the capitalism facing us in Britain today or the United States is the same as that which faced our forebears in the 1900s, 1920s, etc. Deindustrialization, social atomization, the promotion of what I would regard as like extremely degenerate individualist trends, the promotion of like narcotics abuse, alcoholism, things like that, pornography consumption. All of these are symptoms of a capitalism in a very rotten, decaying state. We need to analyze that properly. These are problems which were somewhat there. Engels wrote about the tendency of the British working class to be pushed towards alcoholism in the 1840s. So it's always been there. There's things we can take from the method and the analysis that should help us make sense of our current situation. But what we must foreground is this struggle for the reintegration of Marxism with the working class again, or at least the vanguard of the working class. And I will continue to defend the core concepts of democratic centralism as the best way to organize. I continue to defend the analysis put forward by Lenin, both in the one step forward, two steps back, and also in the subsequent development of the Bolshevik Party. I believe that democratic centralism is the best way for us to organize. I also believe that almost nobody does it anymore.
Right.
In fact, most of the left in the West has succumbed to various forms of liberalism in their organization. But I'll conclude on this point. I think that the point that we both agree on to some extent and disagree on is the need to rebuild working class militancy is a point that we agree on. How to get there, I think, is a point of disagreement, which I'm happy to revisit in the future if Chris is willing to, because I regard the integration of Marxism with the working class as absolutely vital. I think there's various different characteristics with regard to each country and each set of class struggles that we face, as to it raises the point of how we do that. But in my view, if the class struggle is to be successful, it has to be guided by the method of Marxism and by the method of Lenin, because nobody understood the rhythm of politics and the rhythm of struggle better than Lenin. This does not mean a carbon copy of October 1917, but it does mean learning from the way in which Lenin was able to anticipate the moves of the enemy and redraw the demands of the party and integrate the party with the class. Nobody has matched that in almost 100 years. We must learn from it if we are to succeed.
Very good.
Sorry, you muted.
Okay, mic drop. Boom. Now, since you are our guest, or my guest, well, you're both my guests, but you're a first-time guest. We can say goodbye now, or if there's anything you want to plug, anything you want to say, I think I should give you the final word on that, Chris.
I would just say that, again, I've made very specific interventions, and at age where things circulate in all sorts of different spheres. I think that it's easy for the nature of my attempted contributions to generate some misapprehensions. You guys talked about my compact articles. These were things solicited by a right-wing publication. Because
I do not shy away from being provocative, so I'm all like, you go,
right.
Chris.
And I was trying to tweak them as much as I was. Yeah, exactly. I was trying to tweak them as much as tweak the left. And I don't know how effective it is. I don't know, whether it works or it doesn't work. I tried my best, and I try to pursue it in a principled and ethical manner, as best as I do. Again, doesn't mean that there aren't mistakes that I've made, rhetorically or otherwise. But at the same time,
Cornel West says we're all cracked vessels. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, that's certainly true.
Yeah. Is he still running for president? I haven't checked.
I don't know. I actually know Cornel West. I actually have met him. Yeah, of course. So, but anyway, so I appreciate the chance to clarify myself, and I thought this was a great discussion. I think that I have a much better understanding of where you're coming from, Alexander, now. A much improved understanding, and more. I think that I'm more appreciative of your perspective now than I started out. And so, perhaps we will have future engagements.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Alexander, thank you as well. Everybody, please. You can go ahead and sign off now. I'm just going to wrap up. Thank you, Chris, very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tara.
Last
Thanks,
Marxist, maybe.
Thanks, everybody.
He's on the fence.
Comrades, take care.
Bye. All right. So let's see. Okay. Oops. I'm huge again. That always happens, and it freaks me out. All right. So that was a great episode. I'm happy that Chris was able to come on, and we were able to work that out, that we could have a sharp but respectful conversation. We couldn't go through every single issue, but I think we've covered more than enough for one meal, shall we say. Please do like, follow, subscribe to this channel. And also do check out Chris's work and Alexander's work. I will put up a slide where you can find that, you can locate them. Alexander, I know, is doing 2 or 3 live streams or shows a week with his institute. And he's also doing 1 or 2 a week with Kit Clarenberg, who's an investigative journalist with the Gray Zone and others. They do Decline and Fall, 1 or 2 episodes a week. Really fantastic stuff. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time. And I'm going to drop down and I'm going to put some slides up, information about morbid symptoms, and also Alexander McKay and Chris Cutrone. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.